would be a medical supervision in my view. The follow-up by Dr. Miller was directed at the medical view of using products which have such effects in a social setting, but also a review of where compounds are available and suitable for a medical practitioner. So we have opiates that are misused. We have a whole ton of medications that are misused. People focus on opiates, but there is a list as long as my arm of the medications that are misused, that are not, they are prescription only, but they're not controlled substances. When I say controlled substances, most people think of Percocet, Norco, Tylenol with codeine, Phenergan with codeine, all these things that have an opiate in them. But there's more than that to controlled substances as well. The primary focus of what I'm talking about today is marijuana. And when I say marijuana, that's a big word. When I say cannabis, that's a big word in terms of meaning. But the reality of it is that the marijuana, as we think of it today in what we're talking about in this culture at this time, is primarily a very narrow focus. But all of it is categorized at a higher level of restriction than your Percocets and your Norcos and your Tylenol with codeine. It is limited to research under authorization by government agencies, and the only place in the United States that actually grows marijuana legally under federal law is actually the University of Mississippi. So we're in a situation where those who are in favor of states' rights, states are exercising their rights. They're making it so that people can have access to these things. But the reality is that federal law says these products are illegal. Now, politicians will do what politicians will do. They'll make policy or they'll enforce laws. But I'm more focused on the product, what it is, what it does, and the issues that are pertaining to it in the context of medical marijuana and the potential misuse of it. So a medical practitioner can prescribe to a patient in the usual course of practice for an approved indication or diagnosis. Dr. Miller outlined both uses and potential abuses. Do physicians prescribe outside of the box as outlined above? Yes. Off-label prescribing by doctors is done all the time. If you look at any product that is on a pharmacy shelf, even an over-the-counter product, it's there, it says for and how to use it. If you use it in a different way than that, other than that, then the government says you're using it off-label. Now, there are perfectly valid reasons why a physician or a team of physicians would use something off-label. We wouldn't have treatment for cancers today if they didn't go off-label. We wouldn't have treatment for a whole host of things if they didn't go off-label. So we know that it's not going off-label is the problem. Off the reservation is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. It's the risk and benefit. It's the intent. So the intention to use something in an appropriate way to get an appropriate response for a medical condition is where we're looking at. And that's more or less where Dr. Miller focused last week. There's knowledge and there's risk. And he spoke about both of those in the context of what he was talking about. So today, as part of this triplet of Sunday schools, my goal is to give information mainly about medical marijuana issue and bring some other issues in with that. So last week, Dr. Miller declared you all to be a bunch of rebellious, disobedient sinners. A whole lot of you. Well, I was not here. But it was emphatic on YouTube, I can tell you. So, where should we start? I'm going to mention the impending law first of all. Proposition 2 in Utah is if you download the voter pamphlet on the computer and click on the actual detail of the proposition itself, you get presentations for and against it. You walk through them and you read them, and that's fine. You go to the bottom of that and you get the actual act. It's 28 pages. I read it. It was painful. But the point I'm making is, and I really have to keep on track here, the point I'm making is that law proves exactly what Dr. Miller said we are. Because if you read it and you think of the human condition, everything in that law is if, then, if, then. Does that remind you of anything in the Bible? The first 5 books. What does God say? If, then, if, then. Because we wouldn't do what we were told. We still don't. So the proposed law in Proposition 2 is going to get overridden by a subsequent movement that has taken place. A pharmacist in Cedar City, Evan Vickers, is heavily involved in this. I think his motivation is noble. He wants the thing to be brought to the table in a way that there will be a use for medical marijuana, as Dr. Miller outlined last week, where that product can be used safely, effectively, under controlled conditions, and I mean controlled in the sense of appropriate medical supervision. That bill that's proposed in Proposition 2 is going to get, the proposition is probably going to pass because people have an emotional, remember what Dr. Miller said last week, they have an emotional response to this stuff. They don't think about it in a clear clinical term. So that problem is there, but they're going to pass it probably 60-40 or something like that. Okay, after that's passed, they've decided amongst themselves at the legislative level, including the governor, that they're going to bring something else to the table which will reflect a lot of what's in that law, but they're bringing in other things because they realize the implementation of what that law actually required was basically to say, we're going to create the FDA and the DEA again within the state. It becomes so administratively cumbersome, it becomes impossible. But they have to do something because they know that's where the whole thing is going. So for sure, there's going to be a provision for medical marijuana in Utah law. And Governor Herbert has said he will sign it. So when they come down to a point where the politicians bring something to a point and put it before him, he will sign it. Now, we all know what politicians can do and won't do and will do. There's all sorts of what ifs and ands and buts and all of that. You all understand that, you're all adults, you get it. So that part of it, I would ask you to watch very carefully, and if you see something that you think is objectionable, don't be afraid to submit something online to the governor or whoever to make it known that there is a problem with what they're doing. Like I say, there is a noble intent here. They want to make it so that people who need something that can give them medical benefit available. But federal law says it's Schedule 1, which means it cannot be used unless the University of Mississippi gives it to you. Okay. What is marijuana? Depends on who you are and where you're from. In the USA, marijuana is spoken of as medical or recreational. Same product, just different uses. Or the medical can be refined down to be a little bit more specific in what's in it. And it can be a little bit better quality and all the rest of that. I'll come to that in a minute. So our primary view on the medical use of the plant derivative. Again, as Dr. Miller pointed out, we don't know enough. There's over 100 different cannabinoids, the drugs that are viewed in marijuana. THC is the one everyone knows about. CBD is now the one everyone is talking about. The plant is harvested in such a way as to maximize these products out of, but they're also getting all these other chemicals that I'll mention in a minute. So but we do have facts about what we're dealing with. So Indian hemp is the plant. If you take Indian hemp in India and bring it to Europe, it will grow a different style, it will produce tons of fiber, it will produce no THC worth talking about, and it will have some CBD in it. If you take it in India, in Bangladesh, and in Pakistan, it grows wild and it's high in THC. Not as high as the stuff that's being produced in the little factories that we have going on in houses that are drawing juice like no other from the power systems around us for the last 20 years. The product is the dried, flowering, and fruity top of the plant from which no resin has been removed, because the resin is what they're after. As an aside, the plant in Europe and Asia will produce hemp fiber in large quantities, and the seeds will also be used to produce hemp oil, which brings me to another subject. There's hemp oil, there's CBD oil. They are not one and the same thing, even though when you go looking at it on the web, you will see those interchangeably switched and swapped and used. Hemp oil is not rich in any of the cannabinoids particularly, but it depends on how it's sourced. There are people who say they're producing hemp oil. Pure hemp oil, well produced, is high in essential fatty acids and non-essential fatty acids that are actually medically beneficial to people. So there's no problem there. The problem is it's coming from a plant that is Schedule 1. The plant from the root to the top is Schedule 1, which means nobody can have it in this country unless the government says so. So, okay, that's the hemp oil. CBD oil then is where someone takes the resin that contains rich in CBD and puts it in. They may use hemp oil to dilute it. They may use coconut oil. They may use olive oil. And the manufacturers of these things, it's like the Wild West. Every manufacturer is producing a different product with different levels of CBD and THC. Now, the THC level, they say, is in parts per million, which means that when you try and detect it in someone that would be using it, it should be undetectable, except in gas chromatography, where you're literally refining it down to that level. Now, the THC part is the part that everyone is interested in the recreational side of things. But it's also of interest in some medical areas. The CBD is of interest in medical areas primarily, because it doesn't give you the high, so the recreational guys could care less, right? So you have to distinguish what you're talking about when you're talking about it, because it can be confusing. But don't confuse hemp oil pure and CBD oil, and you will quite often see CBD hemp oil, just to confuse things even further. Sorry, but I'm trying to nail it down here. THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. It's the chemical name for a product that is extracted out of the resin and the flowering top of the plant. It is the active ingredient that causes the high when someone smokes it. CBD is another one of over 100 of these chemicals. So when you go in and you split them up into all the different chemicals, you get over 100, there's well over 100 of these things now. And they're still working on identifying what they all do. Okay. So in India, it'll be called Bang, Hindustani. In Arabic, it's called hashish. In regular Indian, it's called ganja. You have two types. You have Bombay or Bengal, depending on which side of the country you're in. So you have, in plant drugs generally, when we were at school, pharmacognosy was one of those subjects that is now dead in pharmacy schools. They don't touch it. But guess what? Most of the drugs that we use, not now, but a lot of the drugs that we use were derived at some point along the way from a plant source or modified something from a plant source. The nature of plant drugs is that they have been the source of many medical successes in the past, pharmacological successes in the past over the years. Now the synthetic industry has taken over and they keep modifying and changing what they find themselves. It's different now than it was even 30 years ago. But the plant source doesn't mean that it's good necessarily. We have drugs that come from plants that are very successful in treating medical conditions. We have drugs that come from plants that are downright dangerous. Anyone know anything about hemlock? So, all the grades that I just mentioned are the raw drug, and they're produced on the other side of the world. What people do here is they put them in very controlled growing conditions. They have people who are experts at maximizing the conditions to get the largest amount of THC out of that plant. Now, those people are interested in THC for the recreational market because that's where the money is. And the money is a huge issue in all of this. Absolutely huge. It's also huge for the pharmaceutical industry because they're interested in the pharmaceutical actions of all this. And they've held back for a long time, but now they're getting into it. And there's a company that just got approved on one particular product very recently. And before too long, because they're a small company, they're going to get gobbled up by one of the big boys. Because the big boys have been waiting to let all the runners make the run. Because of the legal situation, they're not stepping in yet. But there will be a point down the road, because just a couple of weeks ago, the DEA gave a company in Canada the right to import marijuana products into the US. That's the start of the thin edge of the wedge of that kind of activity. Once that starts, you know the snowball's going to happen. And it's not about policy at this point, it's about individual little decisions. But it will eventually come to a place where a policy will be made as a result of all that. Okay. So in harvesting the parts of the plant, there are many compounds that are basically, they're organic in nature, but they're of different types of compounds chemically. I'll run them off. You don't even have to think about them. Cannabinoids, flavonoids, terpenes, terpenoids, sterols, thiols, phenols, lipids, fibrous material. So the fibrous material has been used in hemp for years as a source of fiber. You've heard of hemp bags and all that kind of stuff. Lipids are important because the drugs that come in, the cannabinoids and the rest, are soluble in lipid. Our nerves are primarily made up of lipid material, and our nerves like anything that likes lipid. So they will absorb it, hence the drugs get into the central nervous system very easily. It's presented in a whole host of forms. If you go looking out for this thing, I mean, they've caught up with the vaping thing, which I still don't fully understand that. But all I know is it heats up something to allow someone to inhale whatever it is, and it doesn't create smoke. That's my limited understanding of it because I've chosen not to even bother understanding it. Cigarettes, reefers, whatever you want to call them. Buds are the heads of the plant themselves. The wax is extremely potent. It's like 95% THC. Tinctures are dissolved in alcohol. Under the tongue, people put it. Cookies. The cookies are a big issue because of the delayed effect. I'll come back to that in just a second. Nutter butter, same thing. Suppositories. I'm serious when I go. Okay, we have legal forms of marijuana products. THC, dronabinol, Marinol, Dr. Miller mentioned it last week. It is a derivative of THC. It's used to stimulate appetite. It's used to promote the lack of weight loss in some people. How effective it is to be determined, really. We use it, but we're not fully convinced it's fully effective. There's Nabilone, which is used in other situations. There's a new product called Nabiximols, which is a 50-50 mix of THC and CBD. It's licensed in other countries, 27 different other countries around the world. They're trying to get it licensed here, and it is used largely in helping people with spasticity associated with MS. Cannabidiol is Epidiolex. The new product that I mentioned is being released for specific, and I mean specific, epilepsies, 2 that are pediatric in nature. So for children's epilepsy of a particular type, this drug has now been licensed. Now, the company that brought these drugs to the FDA to get them licensed have been given permission to bring it to the marketplace, and it will be in the marketplace, I believe, in November. It's going to be like $36,000 a year to get the use of it. So you can see this is a very limited market. It's a niche market for a very limited number of children. However, they're also asking the FDA for permission to go trialing on others. See, they got the toe in, now they're going to do the rest of it. Now, do I agree or disagree with that? Philosophically, I don't, because they're trying to do the medical thing correctly. The issue will be how will, like any good thing that comes along, there will be people that will find a way to misuse it and abuse it. Okay, so when you breathe it in, it takes seconds to take effect. So if you smoke it, it's fast. It lingers around for 2 to 3 hours. If you take it through the gut with your brownies that we all joke about, it takes a lot longer to take effect. So what happens? Someone takes a brownie, they have no effect. They take another one, they have no effect. They take another one, they have no effect. Suddenly, bam! They got it. And they suddenly realize life isn't as interesting as it was before they started. That's the fat solubility issue that I'm talking about. It gets into the fat, but it's slow to get released from the fat as well, so it'll stay. So when it gets there, it eventually hurts. Now, it's the central nervous system that's primarily being affected here. They use it through the skin. It has poorer penetration, so it takes longer to get in. It can take up to an hour to get into the system from it, and it can linger for anywhere up to 2 or 3 hours. So it's kind of like the lungs, but the lungs are faster by far than the skin. So like I said earlier, in the medical area, we're talking about risk versus benefit of using these compounds. And I'm using the word compound carefully there because compound is what I referred to when Jay asked about THC. That's a chemical compound. Marijuana or cannabis is referring to a collection of a whole pile of chemicals that I just mentioned a minute ago. In the recreational area, their whole purpose is impairment. Now, I refer back to Pastor's teaching on the first Sunday on this. Impairment is not where we want to be as believers, but we don't want the world to be there either. Because the issues are huge on so many areas. If I had 3 weeks, I could go through a whole thing and, you know, you'd hear me rant. So what do these things do? They go into the brain. The THC goes into the brain. It affects the appetite. It affects motor control. It affects coordination. It affects emotional control. It affects nausea. It affects pain. It affects memory. It affects learning. It affects planning. It affects execution. It affects intention. It affects higher cognitive functions after all of that. Now, does alcohol do all that? To a large degree. Do opiates do anything with that? Some. So, you know, risk, benefit. How much, how often, and for how long? The CBD is a little bit easier to narrow down because we're talking about something that their real focus there is the epilepsy right now. And they're looking at other conditions as well, but the epilepsy is a big part of it. We have within us a central nervous system, a digestive system, a muscular system. We have the skin, which is an organ all by itself, the biggest organ in the body. We have an endogenous cannabinoid system. Who knew? Nobody talks about it. But they have discovered, back in the 70s, they did discover there is a system within us that has receptors. So when I say receptors, when you take a chemical and you put it in your body, it's going to have an action on something. When it comes to the surface of a cell, depending on which cell in the body it's going to act, it's going to interlock with something that is a protein, basically, that has a certain shape. This thing is the chemical that comes in. It has a shape that fits with this. By fitting with it, it causes a reaction. So when you hear people talking about receptors, that's where we're going here. It's like an electric plug going into a socket. There's a response. You get juice. So the cannabinoid system, there are 2 sides to it that we know of so far. You see, one of the wonderful things about all this, when you go looking at all this, is all it does is remind you of how fearfully and wonderfully made we are. That there's a God that thought of all of this long before anyone else found out about it. And are we glad of that? The receptors, anandamide is one side, and arachidonyl glycerol is the other side. These 2 receptors are basically or sorry, these are the chemicals in the body that we produce that cause the cannabinoid responses that keep things stable. So in epilepsy, when something is out of stability and you give CBD, the suggestion is we're not there yet, but we're thinking that the CBD brings that back into center. By the same token, with pain, if you give the THC, the anandamide system is off, it brings it back into focus. So we're dealing with a whole system in the body that there are people that have been researching this for a long time, and they're very effective at what they're doing. But the problem is the more they find out, just like everything, the more they know, the more they find out they don't know. So they're still going with it. In the background, you have the movement on the recreational thing going on all the time. Bear that in mind, I'll come back to it. So the endocannabinoids work on the system. They work in all sorts of areas of our body, not just in the central nervous system. They work peripherally as well, in our muscular system, in our fatty tissue, in our digestive system, in our renal system. This is an area where they have action. The thinking is that, you know, if we can get a handle on how they work in the different areas, we can narrow it down and be very specific and targeted in how we deal with issues. That's a good thing. That's the way the medical process goes. It's not all, let's go out to the beach and go, you know. So we're dealing with, in general terms, marijuana there is evidence which is substantial to support its use in chronic pain. There is evidence that is substantial to support its use in spasticity, in nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy. Dr. Miller mentioned all these last week. There's moderate evidence to support that the 50-50 mix that I mentioned, which is CBD and THC, remember now we have our little endogenous cannabinoid system going on here. So we've got these two kind of working in different directions maybe, but they may be also working in the same direction. We don't know all the story yet. But there's moderate evidence to suggest that they help with sleep difficulties and issues related to pain, MS, fibromyalgia, and sleep apnea. So there's information coming in all the time on this. There's limited evidence as to the effectiveness on increasing the appetite or slowing weight loss. I referred to that a little bit earlier, particularly in relation to HIV/AIDS. But it's still used because the thinking is something is better than not having anything at all. If they get something out of it, they'll go with it. On improving anxiety in people with social anxiety disorder. There's very limited evidence on that. On improving PTSD, although there is one drug that they've tried using on it, and it's not showing the results they were hoping. On improving better outcomes after traumatic brain injuries, same thing. There's limited evidence that it's ineffective. Now that means that there's low evidence to show that it's ineffective for dementia. That doesn't mean to say it's effective for dementia, or it's saying that the thinking is that it's ineffective, but they're not there yet. Glaucoma and macular degeneration got a little bit of a hype with personalities that were talking about it and that, but there is clear evidence. First of all, smoking the thing is going to cause respiratory problems, again, as Dr. Miller mentioned medically last week. That leads to other issues. But the actual action of the drug itself on the nature of the macular degeneration is not what optometrists and ophthalmologists, I'm sorry, I went transatlantic in my head there for a second. What they're finding is not what they want on that. There was a suggestion that it might, but it doesn't. Reducing depressive symptoms in chronic pain or MS. Now think about this for a second. If you're depressed because of the condition you have, if you take something that depresses your central nervous system, where are you going to go? Worse. Now, they may be able to narrow it down and find one of those cannabinoids actually has a positive effect, but that's the work of the medical pharmaceutical industry coming together and doing the right thing for it. Let's see, where are we? Okay. There's no evidence to either support or refute its use in the treatment of psychosis or Parkinson's or ALS or IBS and a whole host of other conditions. They're looking at everything on this because everyone wants a piece of the pie. Money. Side effects of use of the plant product. In the central nervous system, you have lethargy, sedation, slowed reaction time. I use this illustration all the time because I want people to understand the importance of this. When you take your Tylenol PM at night at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night and you go to bed, the next day at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, if you were to measure your reaction time, you would find it is slower than it was the week before when you had none of that stuff in your system. Your reaction time at a traffic light is going to be slower. Your reaction time if something is coming at you is going to be slower. So we know the impact that these things have in our system. We understand that. But we have to be aware that this is also where this social thing is going. Visual disturbances. Can someone tell me that that's not a problem if we let this out in the general population, just free willy? Impaired coordination, as we mentioned earlier, memory function, memory recollection, loss of focus. In the breathing system, you've got coughing, wheezing, sputum production are all affected by it. In the cardiovascular system, you've got an increased heart rate and increased blood pressure. Drug interactions. How many people in here are not taking a medication prescribed by a doctor? About 30% of you. See what I mean? This stuff has a huge impact on a large number of the drugs that are typically prescribed for people as they go through life. I'll put it that way. Not to nail down any particular area, but you have drugs that cause induction of the metabolism of other drugs. You have drugs that cause repression of the metabolism of other drugs, thereby affecting the level of those drugs in the system. Marijuana interferes with those. You have direct effects, obviously, like I said, if you're going to use marijuana and you're taking something to treat depression and you take marijuana, they're fighting each other. Now, you take the product that's just been approved for epilepsy and they go and they give another anti-epileptic with it, what's the effect of that going to be? They've got to be careful there. So we have all these issues that are still being worked on. Safety issues are huge. Now, the obvious one is unintentional exposure. I remember a story many years ago. We were talking to a guy back in Ireland who was a member of the drug squad in Dublin. Back in the day when Dublin was a lot smaller and the drug population was well known to all the cops and they knew where they were going and dealing with. They went up to one of the warehouses down in the Guinness factory one morning and they were walking around checking out the place because they knew something had been going on there. And this is back in the days when the psychedelic stuff was in vogue. And he was just about to put his hand on the frame of a window. And the other guy that was with him saw what was on the window frame and grabbed his hand away. And it was one of those little strawberry things that had the LSD in it, that as soon as you touch it, it's going to go in through your skin. So accidental exposure, hazards of the job for a police officer. Sorry, guys. Accidental exposure for a child leads to the emergency room. Accidental overuse, again, an issue. Or we have a problem with prescription pills being stolen already. Even kids will go into their own parents' medication cabinets and take whatever is there. This is already a big issue. You think it's not going to get any worse with the marijuana? Of course it is. The other issues, though, that come down are, like I said, there's a whole host of people out there producing CBD at the moment, and they're selling it. I work in an industry that is so highly regulated. Someone bringing a drug to market, it costs them millions. Tens of millions, probably, anymore. They have to prove the purity of the product, the lack of contamination, the lack of adulteration. By adulteration, I mean in the case of a plant drug particularly, where someone takes something else that looks awfully like marijuana and stuffs it in there to bulk it up so that they can get more for their bang for their buck in selling it, but in terms of effectiveness, it has no beneficial effect. So the quality assurance of the source of the product and the final product is huge. People are taking these supplements, as they're categorized now, CBD oils and such, and they're using them in a manner that is topical. They're putting it on their skin, they're consuming it. The content of the actual cannabinoid they're looking for and the other stuff is not determined accurately. They're in the dark and they're flying blind. So there are huge issues there. Pregnant mothers get nausea when they're in their early trimesters of pregnancy. And in Colorado now, it's not uncommon for a young pregnant mother to be smoking a reefer. Now, Dr. Miller already laid out for you what happens to the development of a brain. But if you're going to start when the poor things, the neural tube is barely laid down, you're in a whole different ball of wax. Because if they're going to get it there, they're going to get secondary smoke for the rest of their lives until they grow up in that home, more likely. Now, pain patients trying to use opiates and marijuana to mitigate against the use of the opiates. There is evidence to suggest that the appropriate use of marijuana in that situation can actually reduce the amount of opiate people need, which is a good thing. Will it, standardization of that, how do you measure it? How do you know what dose and all that? That's all stuff we have to learn yet. We're still working on that. There's a cost, just like Dr. Miller said last week for alcohol and opiates, there's a cost for marijuana as well. There's a cost as an individual, as a society. There's definitely a financial cost. And there's someone going to pay and there's someone going to reap. As believers, we need to be good stewards. The world will push every issue through activism using the emotional argument instead of the appropriate processes to bring these issues into an area of policy. Problem is we do a reactionary thing. There ought to be a law against that, just because it happened, instead of saying, okay, can we change behavior here or something, you know. So this is a part of the problem in society. The reduction in opiates is one of the pressures that's going on at the moment. Now, I don't have to deal with it nearly as much as Jill does, but over the counter for her, it's almost, I've no idea how many times a day she has to deal with the issues of calling a physician who is the expert, and I'm not picking on Dr. Miller here, because he pointed to the experts who are the guys that run the pain clinics. But the guys that run the pain clinics don't want to be told by the government what to do. And their pride is just a little bit out of joint. And they need to get their heads out of the sand and recognize the fact that the issue is still the issue. And the other thing that comes into play here, again, the money, is insurance. The doctor's office will approve a prescription for an opiate, for a certain amount of opiate, because they want the insurance to pay for it. Whereas if they reduce the dose, the insurance may not pay for it. Yeah. This has been coming for a very long time. When I first came here in 1995, I was down in Linz doing my pharmacy internship hours. And I've said it to some people here already, but I was ashamed of the fact that within 3 weeks of being there, watching people walk in the door at a distance to the front door of the building here, coming around the corner, walking towards the pharmacy, I could pick them out, the drug seekers, instantly. Their walk, their behavior, their attitude, the whole demeanor about them. I didn't pick them all out because some of them were a lot different, but a large percentage of them were easily seen. I was stunned at the prescription opiate problem in this country back then. I mean, Ireland is as bad now, but back then it wasn't. So, you know, these cultural things happen, and they spread, and they spread. But as far as marijuana is concerned, there's activism there that's pushing this agenda all along. And it's been going on now for a long time. I mean, it's a long time since California made marijuana legal. We were just up in Oregon. You cross the border from Oregon. I took a picture of it. You cross the border from California into Oregon. There's this great big sign. State line cannabis. Big sign. Literally right the second you cross the border. It's right there. And then there's a store there with weed open. So, you know, I mean, it has become part of the culture up there already. There's a medical marijuana issue that is important, that we explore and find out those areas that will be beneficial to us as humans for medical issues. But the problem is it's a wedge that opens the bigger issue as well. That's my opinion. Take it for what it's worth. I do agree with Dr. Miller. We still have a lot to learn pharmacologically and medically about the appropriate use of these compounds. They do need to be regulated. Because we need to be regulated, as he pointed out so clearly last week, because we're a bunch of rebellious, disobedient sinners. We can't do the right thing while using alcohol, opiates, or marijuana. We're just not able to do the right thing because they've compromised us. Now, both Pastor and Dr. Miller highlighted that in the past 2 weeks. Dr. Miller said something last week on it, and when I watched it on YouTube, I just laughed because the first person I thought of was Joel Osteen, which was wrong. He said, your best world is yet to come. And remember what he was talking about. He was talking about dealing with and enduring the issues of life today here, because where we are here now is serving Christ. And what we do is serving Christ. And we can choose to do that, or we can choose to let the world lead us astray. There are options. But his point was, we know where our best life is. It's coming. Whereas in Joel Osteen's world, this is not your best life now as a certain, or this, in his world, this is your best life now. Well, if this is the best life that life has to offer me, why would I be a Christian? You know? Obviously, it finally comes back to who and what is the authority in your life. And I've hammered this hammer many times in the past. Is the authority God? Is it God's word? Do we submit to him? Do we submit to his word? Do we obey him? And do we glorify him? So, when Pastor proposed doing this, he asked us a couple of questions. He asked me a couple of questions, and I've not incorporated them into this because I could have gone on for another week, but it's nearly a quarter to, but I'm going to quickly do a quick fire on some of the questions he asked. Is marijuana addictive? Yes. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying through their teeth. Is marijuana a gateway drug? Yes. Ask any addict and they'll tell you where they started. This is the way the pastor phrased the question. Are marijuana derivatives better than opiates, better for specific needs? And he mentions a couple of issues. They're not better, they're different. And that's what a lot of what I was talking about was, we're trying to figure all that out. They are different and they have a place. Okay. What are the effects of marijuana on the brain of body, teens, older? Dr. Miller addressed that last week. Are pharmaceutical companies worse than the dealer down the street? My answer to that is maybe. And I work for a pharmacy company, not a pharmaceutical producing company, but I think the industry has played a cute game. They're watching what's going on, they're holding back, and they're ready to fire on all four cylinders as soon as the the go-ahead comes. They will be there. Then there's the psychological, the physiological versus the psychological versus the spiritual. Are any of the following statements true? Some people have something verifiably wrong with their body, chemical nature, traumatic brain injury, various glands producing endogenous products like I talked about earlier. That's true. We do have people who have different issues depending on what's being produced and what's not being produced. Can we address those medically where we find an appropriate product that will do it? Sure. Do we just throw marijuana at it willy-nilly? I disagree. That's where I draw the line. There has to be an understanding of what are we doing with it and why. The psychological, where we have people who have, there's physical issues, there's psychological issues, depression, anxiety, all those things. Are they an issue of chemical imbalance? Quite often they are. Not always. Sometimes it's a choice. We can choose to be, down in the mouth and all the rest of it. But there are, for example, schizophrenia is a clear example of where if someone is schizophrenic and they're identified as such, they have an imbalance that we know about in their system. We know how to adjust for it. The treatments are not ideal. What we're using today is not ideal. ADHD, they're throwing drugs at it that I despair as to what our generation is going to be when they grow up. Because I think they're going to be laced with a lot more problems because of the fact that they've been using medications during a time in their life while they're still growing and developing. I really have concerns about that. And it's an area that is, it's like parents have just absolved themselves of any responsibility in certain areas, and that's part of the issue. Drinking a glass of wine every day. If I had $1 for every report that came out saying a glass of wine is good for you, a glass of wine is bad for you, I'd be a wealthy man in the course of my life. I think Dr. Miller made the case. He nailed it last week, so I don't need to go there. I don't like doctors or medicine. Well, my advice to you is go to the doctor. Because what you think you know is not nearly as good as what he knows or what he's going to do for you. Pulling drugs from south of the border. We had a problem with this years ago in Europe. They called it parallel imports. What was happening was the manufacturers that were producing all the drugs in Britain were also producing drugs in all these countries around Europe. And this is the early days of the European Union. And they were bringing these drugs back into Britain because they were selling them at way below cost out there. But the British government said, you can't do that because we've told you this is the price we're going to pay you in the NHS. So if you bring in a cheaper thing, you're making more profit. Therefore, we're going to take your profit away. So it was all about the money. But down in Mexico, the question is it a pharmaceutical grade product or is it something that's dressed up to look like a pharmaceutical grade product? And I'm not being anti-Mexican when I say that. I'm just saying that if you have a loose market and the control of these things, loose things will happen. Let's put it that way. So, will drugs fix people? In some cases, yes. I'm a testimony to that myself. So we're back to who's your authority? Are you willing to submit? Are you willing to obey? And are you willing to live your life in the service of Christ? Let's pray. Father, we do thank you so much that you have given us all that you give us in our lives. You have provided so much that we have an abundance in every area of our lives. Compared to those around the world who live in parts that are poor and they're forced into dealing with the abuse and misuse of these products because it's perceived by them to be a means of getting out of living everyday life. Father, we know these things alter our lives and the thinking that we have and the way we can go forward for you. We pray that you would use us to keep us from them, help us not to be sinful and in making choices, that we would be wise and obedient to your word. We pray that your Holy Spirit would keep each one of us focused on serving you and doing your will as we go through our lives. Help us to deal with the issues of life, Lord, in a biblical way. These things I do pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen.